I'm John McIntyre. I'm still really not accustomed to all this video recording stuff, so I'm keeping a goat handy in case extreme measures are called for. Today I've been asked to talk about the role of interfaith as a major, perhaps the major, driver of the Scottish Pagan Federation's strategy to educate our civic society about the realities of modern paganism. An educational process that was also to gain us a very significant degree of official recognition. In this, I'll draw heavily on my own experience as Scottish PF's National Interfaith Officer from 1994 until 2018. I've also been asked to describe the first 18 years or so of our campaign on the Scottish Census. I was very heavily involved in that as well, and the two campaigns were always closely integrated. Although my talk will focus only on the major points, I'd better apologise in advance for the length of time it'll take me to get through it. This was a process of more or less continuous investigation, diplomacy, lobbying and negotiation that went on for 18 years. My hair's turned white for a reason. Interfaith, at least in theory, is a wonderfully simple and progressive idea. It's about bringing people from different religions together in dialogue and observance to develop mutual trust, respect and understanding. However, people are people and history is history. Consequently, the practical realities of interfaith do not always quite work like that, especially when interfaith is taking place at national level. Inevitably at that level, there are political dimensions to at least some of what is happening. There are questions about which religions are included and which are not, which religious bodies have privileged access to political influence and which do not, who is in the room when certain matters are discussed and who is not. Now, most of my experience of interfaith has been at or near national level, so there will be a certain amount of religious politics in this talk. Scottish PF certainly experienced quite a lot of unfair treatment on the journey to where we are now. But there's no point in getting angry about that sort of thing. It's just human nature. Far better to study what's going on beneath the surface and over time develop strategies to deal with it that will help our people without harming anyone else. Now, by the late 1980s, two leading figures in the Pagan Federation, Prudence Jones and Vivian Crowley, were already active in interfaith dialogue. In 1987, the Interfaith Network UK was founded with the explicit aim of promoting good relations between people of different religions across the UK through such values as openness, inclusiveness, mutual respect, and generosity of spirit. Interfaith was becoming more organised and more integrated with civic society. However, when Vivian inquired how the Pagan Federation might become formally involved in supporting this important activity, it became rather apparent that openness, inclusiveness, respect and generosity of spirit did not apply to pagans. While the official reason given for rejecting pagan participation was that no IFN UK affiliated interfaith association at that time formally recognised pagans as a faith community, the overall impression, I understand, was simply that the PF was being told to go away. Now, telling the Pagan Federation to go away is a bit like telling a bunch of cats to take up synchronised swimming. It's possible in theory, but just isn't going to happen. The PF began making preparations for an interfaith campaign across all the countries of the UK. In the summer of 1994, I was asked by the then district managers of PF Scotland, Jean and Jim Fowler, to start this interfaith campaign north of the border. Presumably, this was because I'm a son of the manse, and thus familiar with both Christianity in general and the specific internal culture of the established kirk in particular. I duly approached the Edinburgh Interfaith Association to begin negotiations for pagan faith community membership. I must stress that everyone I had dealings with in Aoife was unquestionably a fine human being. It would also be fair to say that not all of them immediately welcomed the possibility of our joining them. Many had no idea that paganism still existed in the modern world. Others associated us with the prurient nastiness so popular in the gutter press of those days, though of course no respectable person of faith could ever admit to reading such papers, at least not in public. This was not, however, an insurmountable problem. Like sensible people, we all got on with talking to each other. Our application attracted a certain amount of media attention. On 30th December 1996, the Edinburgh Evening News warned the good citizens of our capital city that witches spell out shock bid to link up, holy row over pagans. I rather doubt many needed reviving with smelling salts afterwards. Later on, after a well-attended public meeting on our membership bid, the same Evening News was kind enough to say that we didn't seem too bad after all, which is high praise indeed in Scotland. In 1998, Scottish PF was welcomed into faith community membership of the Edinburgh Interfaith Association. We had secured recognition from our first major civic interfaith body, affiliated to the Interfaith Network UK. At this point, I must express heartfelt gratitude to then EIFA's General Secretary James Russell, a man of absolute integrity and staunchly liberal views. He insisted from the beginning that our application must be considered in exactly the same way as any other. He ensured that we had opportunity to state our case and debate its merits. We have never looked back from that. This campaign for membership of Aoife was the first major test of the Scottish Pagan Federation's ability to reach out beyond the pagan community and engage with Scottish civic society as a religious organisation in our own right. We learned a very great deal from it. In addition, awareness of the pagan revival in Scotland began to spread through the wider Scottish interfaith scene of that time. SPF also formed strong, enduring links with the Edinburgh Hindus, the Edinburgh Buddhists, and the Edinburgh Unitarians. All of this was to stand us in good stead during our next major challenge, the campaign for membership of the newly forming Scottish Interfaith Council. Now, the Scottish Interfaith Council emerged from discussions within an informal committee, the Scottish Interfaith Consultative Group. This consisted of the Scottish members of the Interfaith Network UK. It had been set up to create a national successor body to IFN UK here in Scotland. Pagans, of course, were not invited. However, I knew what was happening through the Edinburgh Interfaith Association and started sending polite inquiries to them about SPF membership of this new national body in 1998. All such inquiries were equally politely turned aside. None of you will be surprised if I now take a moment to launch into a digression about the traditional role of religion in Scottish life. Nowadays we live in a predominantly secular society, and I know it can be difficult to appreciate just how much religion mattered in the Scotland of even a few decades, let alone a few centuries ago. While our English neighbours have tended to be fairly pragmatic in matters of faith, we have not. The Reformation came to Scotland not in relation to how many wives some king could get his leg over, but through the harsh and rigorous teachings of Geneva's Jean Calvin. For centuries afterwards, Scots debated, argued, and all too often fought over theology with all the stubborn, grim ferocity by which the rest of the world has come to know, if not always to appreciate us. Let it never be forgotten that as recently as 1697, a Scottish divinity student, the unfortunate Thomas Aikenhead, was hanged in Edinburgh for blasphemously suggesting that human happiness might form part of the Creator's plan for mankind. When some folk loudly demand that we return to traditional values, I do wonder if they truly understand what they're asking for. In short, Scottish religious history did not suggest that we were the most promising country in the world for paganism to make the breakthrough into national civic recognition. But the timing turned out to be auspicious. A very major cultural change was coming, and Scottish PF was ideally placed to seize upon the opportunities it would bring. When the Union of Parliaments with England was agreed in 1707, the Scottish Parliament was suspended, many assumed permanently. In 1999, our Scottish Parliament was restored, albeit with severely limited powers. This had a dramatic and transformative effect upon Scottish civic culture. There was widespread determination to cast off the legacy of sectarian bigotry that had disgraced us for so long, and in its place embrace a more diverse, inclusive and tolerant society. For its part, Scottish PF now had a small degree of civic recognition, a modest track record of civic engagement, a capable activist cadre, and a very clear strategy for making progress in this new and rapidly changing world. The Scottish Interfaith Council was formally launched on 10th October 1999 at St Mungo's Museum of Religious Life and Art in Glasgow. The Deputy Presiding Officer of the Scottish Parliament was one of the guests of honour. This was a very clear indication of the important role SIFC would hold as a faith consultative body on social, moral and religious matters to the new Scottish Executive and Parliament. I wasn't invited, of course. No pagans were. But I went anyway, as Edinburgh Interfaith Association had thoughtfully appointed me their representative for the day. 7 days earlier, I'd lodged Scottish PF's formal application for membership, and knew all other Scottish religious bodies active in interfaith had been automatically welcomed in. The launch event was very interesting. I made the most of the time, speaking to as many people as possible. Also, and not entirely for amusement, I played a kind of positional game with another guest of honour, the General Secretary of the Interfaith Network UK. IFN UK really did not want pagans anywhere near their new Scottish offshoot. He would move as far away from me as the room permitted. I would wait until he was looking somewhere else and then quietly move up to join whichever conversation he was in. Then repeat. This was no mere pettiness. I was making clear that the issue of pagan inclusion in both the Interfaith Network UK and the Scottish Interfaith Council could not be avoided, and symbolic messaging is best repeated for full effect. On 5th March 2000, the Executive Committee of SIFC decided that Scottish PF's application for membership should be refused because, and I quote, some member groups have indicated their firm opposition. When this was passed on to the full Council for approval 4 days later, matters did not go as they expected. Here I pay heartfelt tribute to a dear friend and fearless advocate for justice, the late Jodie Higgs. She was there as the representative of Edinburgh's Buddhist community, but was also a former priestess of the Fellowship of Isis. Jodie forcefully pointed out that the Pagan Federation was a recognised faith community representative body. Rejecting us because some people didn't like us was blatant religious discrimination, something SIFC had been created to fight against. After all, the founding principle of Scottish Interfaith Council was formally defined as working together as people of faith for a just and inclusive Scotland. So forcefully was this argument put that the Council rejected the Executive's recommendation, instructing them to look again at our application and explore ways of informing SIFC members more fully concerning the nature of the Pagan Federation. Finding genuinely common ground with even a few other faith communities is absolutely essential in this kind of campaigning. It means you have allies who provide information and support. I've obviously just been quoting from the minutes of a meeting I was never meant to see. Allies can also introduce you to other potential supporters. Jodie, of most honoured memory, supported by a handful of other faith representatives, had ensured that we would have the chance to present our case. I should now mention that at this time, quite a number of pagans were not at all convinced that interfaith served any useful purpose. Some were even vociferously opposed to it. In 1998, Pagan Federation President Pete Jennings organised an extensive survey, the VOR report, of what PF members saw as priorities for the years ahead. Respondents thought interfaith dialogue a low priority. It was fourth from the bottom. Even then, I thought this was extraordinarily short-sighted. To at least a few of us back then, it was obvious that nearly all the bigotry directed against pagans came from centuries of ignorant prejudice ingrained within the dominant religious traditions of the Western world. The only way to counter that was to start educating the liberal wings of those established faiths about the realities of modern paganism. Over time, this could shift their mainstream world views. I never understood why this was controversial in some quarters, but controversial it certainly was. Those of us who actively promoted interfaith found ourselves being attacked for undermining and sanitizing paganism, or even selling out to Christianity. Quite how these folk expected the problem to be solved if we shrank from doing anything effective about it was never explained. You win campaigns by getting in among those opposed to you and persuading sufficient numbers of them to change their minds, not by moaning about how persecuted you feel to a closed circle of the similarly afflicted. But while unpleasant for a while, this was a battle quickly won as the value of interfaith became obvious. I mention it here only for the historical record. Returning to Scottish Interfaith Council, it now found itself in something of a quandary. As Jodie had pointed out, it existed to fight religious discrimination, but was being pressured to practice religious discrimination to avoid offending some of its own members. Somewhat awkwardly, it embarked on a process of both engaging seriously with our application for membership, while simultaneously reviewing its criteria for membership, all the time insisting that the two processes had no connection with each other. Also during 1999-2000, SPF had learned that the forthcoming national census of April 2001 would include questions on religious identity for the first time. This was clearly important as it would provide the first opportunity to get accurate statistics on the number of pagans in Scotland. I started lobbying the General Register Office, the Scottish Government Minister for Justice, and the Equal Opportunities Committee of the Scottish Parliament, seeking assurance that GROS would carry out a full analysis of the write-in responses to the religious questions and publish the results. Sadly, this was not to be, and we were told that if we wanted that information we would need to pay for the statistical analysis ourselves. Thus began Scottish PF's National Census campaign. You'll have seen the successful outcome of it in your census forms this very month. The stage was now set for the first formal dialogue meeting between Scottish PF representatives and Scottish Interfaith Council. I had already provided a detailed description of modern paganism in Scotland to SIFC in advance of the meeting. This was backed by extensive academic testimony from Prof. Ronald Hutton, Prof. Richard Roberts, Dr. Graham Harvey, Dr. Michael York, Dr. Marion Bowman, Dr. Vivian Crowley, Dr. Joe Pearson, and Dr. Anne-Marie Gallagher. My grateful thanks to all of them. We all met for the debate at St Mungo's Museum of Religious Life and Art in Glasgow on the 22nd April 2001. Scottish Interfaith Council presented a panel of representatives drawn from Scotland's Baha'i, Brahmakumaris, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, Quaker, Sikh and Unitarian faith communities. In addition, of course, there were Christian representatives from the Church of Scotland, Scottish Roman Catholic Church and the Scottish Episcopal Church, plus some of the smaller denominations. The Scottish Pagan Federation fielded, in addition to myself, Fiona Davidson, the late and very much loved Andy Guthrie, Helen Guthrie, Kitty McIntyre, Chad Reid and Pauline Reid-Adamson, along with PF President Prudence Jones, who came up to Scotland for this meeting. My thanks to all of them for the very effective contributions they made during the long afternoon of dialogue that followed. This was a wide-ranging and mostly courteous discussion. We were asked why the name of pagan aroused such instinctive hostility among some members of other faiths. Our allies immediately pointed out that some groups have an unfortunate history of othering those who do not belong to them, and that terms like Jew had been used in a highly negative way by many in the majority faith community until very recent times. We explained that modern paganism was a very diverse religion, that there was no definitive pagan doctrine, no universal sacred texts, and no authoritative hierarchy, nor did we see any need for these things. We told them that most pagans embraced a synergy of animistic, pantheistic and polytheistic beliefs, with forms of polytheism probably being the dominant strand, that most of us saw nature as a living manifestation of divinity. However, pagans tended to be far more interested in the reality of the divine than in theories about exactly how it might be defined. We explained that we worshipped goddesses as well as gods, were very strongly committed to sexual equality, and that priestesses presided over the great majority of modern pagan ceremonies. We told them that our ethics were largely humanistic, that we thought it natural and right for people to hold a great many different religious beliefs, and that we'd no interest at all in converting anyone. We explained much else besides. It was obvious that while most people were very friendly and very willing to engage with us, some of those present clearly had genuine trouble understanding this. We were not only a different religion to the familiar Western pattern of the past 1500 years or so. We represented a different paradigm of what religion was. To those whose understanding of religion centred on sacred doctrine, revelation, patriarchy and authority, I could well understand why some of this was initially quite baffling, and for a few, perhaps, infinitely more threatening than their earlier fantasies of devil worship. Most, however, thanked us for giving such clear and detailed presentations. The Hindu representatives in particular were enthusiastically supportive. They said that pagans were even more like Hindus than they had previously realised, and they could not understand why any opposed us. They also praised the patience we had shown in the face of sometimes rather impertinent questioning. I would like to take this opportunity to express heartfelt gratitude to Amit and above all to Saroj Lal of the Edinburgh Hindu community. From the moment they realised that paganism had many underlying similarities to Hinduism, they strongly and consistently supported us. That support was to open many doors. Saroj, although always quietly spoken, was a woman of formidable intelligence, energy and kindness. She made an enormous contribution to many community projects, particularly in education, interfaith, and racial equality. They are both sadly missed. This meeting was a crucial step forward. It allows us to explain ourselves in our own terms, directly, to all the significant faith communities and organisations that were part of SIFC, and to answer questions both asked and implied. It moved a number of existing member bodies from neutrality to actively supporting us. But I did notice some less encouraging attitudes and behaviours that it would take us years of further effort to overcome. Although the religious establishments in both Scotland and England had long told us that resistance to pagan inclusion came in large part from objections by many of the minority faiths, it was increasingly obvious that this might not be entirely accurate. The truth was that most minority faith communities at that time knew very little about us, other than what the religious establishment had told them, and some were reluctant to support changes that might seem controversial. The main source of objections to Pagan Federation membership of SIFC was predominantly coming from the two most powerful organisations within it, the Church of Scotland and the Scottish Roman Catholic Church. But this too needs to be put into context. The major churches themselves knew very little about us at this time, and what they thought they knew was largely wrong. Many of them still held to indefensible negative stereotypes and thought of the historical triumph of Christianity in terms that owed far more to myth than to actual history. It was clear at least some of them harboured institutional anxieties about where the changes in Scottish civic culture might be heading. As I reported to Pagan Federation Committee after the meeting, by then Jean and Jim had passed the leadership of Scottish PF on to Kitty and me, and I was coordinating the PF Interfaith campaign in England as well. Opposition appears to be concentrated most strongly among some representatives of the Christian, Muslim and Jewish faiths. It is reasonable to expect that much of this will be based on erroneous stereotypes rather than accurate knowledge of modern Scottish paganism. Many monotheists do have difficulty in understanding polytheistic and non-doctrinal religions. Some members of the established Christian churches do appear to feel threatened by paganism because it is growing rapidly within a culture they are accustomed to regard as theirs. Some appear to view paganism as unethical because we do not approach morality from a lengthy list of prohibitions. However, one Christian representative was heard to say after the meeting that while he dislikes paganism, he feels we should be included. Continuing, it is important to understand that while the attitude of SIFC towards pagans leaves much to be desired at present, the Scottish Interfaith Council in itself is a tremendous step forward for Scotland. It represents a decisive break with that still powerful Scottish tradition which views Christianity, or particular denominations thereof, as the only religion which should be acknowledged by the political process. It has resulted in the early morning prayer sessions in our Parliament being led by representatives of many different faiths, and it symbolises a vision of the new Scotland as a genuinely multi-faith society. It was clear that the meeting had not gone at all as our opponents expected, and that we ourselves were not at all what they expected. Precisely what their expectations of pagans had been, perhaps that a group of New Agers and Dennis Wheatley-type Satanists would wander in only to wilt under questioning, I'll never know. But it's clear that they were not expecting a solid rank of educated, courteous, highly articulate, middle-aged and even respectable-looking people. People who understood them a great deal better than they understood us, and could easily handle everything thrown our way. On 2nd September 2001, Scottish Interfaith Council voted to grant formal observer status to the Scottish Pagan Federation for a period of 2 years. After that, a vote would be taken on our membership application. This allowed us to send a representative to SIFC meetings, access to minutes and other publications, participation in the wide range of civic activity the Council was engaged with, and, as an indirect consequence of that, inclusion in the invitation list for faith-related Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament, and similar national civic events. On 28 October, I attended my first meeting of SIFC and immediately set about arranging discussions with those existing member bodies who were willing to talk to us, while trying my utmost to allay the concerns of those still reluctant to engage. Scottish PF now had its foot in the door and was looking with considerable interest at the hallway. By this time it had also become clear that the Scottish Episcopal Church did not share the objections to paganism held by the Kirk and the Catholic Church. Although it's a part of the Anglican Communion and was subject to pressure to block pagan inclusion from the Church of England, who were not at all happy with what was happening north of the border, the Scottish Episcopals decided that there were no reasonable grounds for excluding us, and strongly supported us on principle from that time on. The next 2 years passed in a blur of activity. I have no idea how many talks I gave or discussions I took part in, but was probably pontificating about pagan inclusion in my sleep. I was still lobbying the General Register Office on pagan responses for the 2001 census in those days. It took years for statistics to be published. Scottish PF had launched both a letter-writing campaign and a parliamentary petition, PE 600, in support of this. Although the petition was not successful, the Public Petitions Committee was quite sympathetic and gave us an estimate for the cost of analysis that looked just about feasible for us. Scottish PF started fundraising immediately, and the Scottish pagan community responded. Louise Park became SPF Celebrants Coordinator and began the work that would ultimately lead to recognition of pagan marriage under Scots law. Within SIFC itself, a small mentoring group was established to track Scottish PF's participation. To gain some understanding of pagan ritual practice, a group of SIFC representatives attended a ritual by the Druid group Carclwyd in Glasgow. Heartfelt thanks to Poshia, Pauline Pitchford, for arranging that. In addition, and this turned out to be of crucial long-term importance, at around this time Scottish Interfaith Council was asked to prepare an official booklet describing Scotland's diverse faith communities. Scottish PF immediately drew up a description of paganism in the required format and submitted it for inclusion in this new guide. In what was now becoming an all too familiar pattern, this was not universally welcomed. Unlike the sections submitted by all the other Scottish religions, the section on paganism was deemed controversial and scheduled for a vote at a meeting in Aberdeen on 11th May 2003. By the morning of the meeting, I'd calculated that we simply could not win that vote. Those opposed to us still outnumbered our supporters. But when the agenda item came around, something completely unexpected happened. Lord Yusuf Innate, sadly no longer with us, was a very prominent figure within the Scottish Muslim community and very highly respected within interfaith circles in particular. He had, certainly in the early days, appeared very cautious about pagans. But now Yusuf pointed out that the multi-faith guide we were considering was to be a guide to faith communities in Scotland, and not a guide to faith communities in the Scottish Interfaith Council. Whether or not the pagans ever became a member of SIFC, he said, we were obviously a faith community in Scotland, and should therefore be included. His words were decisive. None of our opponents voiced objections, and the pagan section was included nem con. I've often wondered what it was that brought Yusuf to make such an unexpected intervention. Perhaps it was that he'd come to understand us better over the years, for he was also a very prominent member of the Edinburgh Interfaith Association. I think it was because he was a devout Muslim with an unshakable sense of justice, and once he'd decided what the right thing to do was, he'd do it no matter what. And so paganism came to be included in a guide to faith communities in Scotland. Hopefully you can see this, or something like it. The official launch event was held in Parliament itself on 24th September 2003, with the presiding officer, George Reid MSP, as host. Our Parliament not only formally endorsed the publication, it ordered thousands of copies be distributed to all MSPs, to the Scottish Civil Service, Scottish NHS, local government, and every statutory body in Scotland. I probably set a record for the number of free copies that could be stuffed into the pockets, waistband and sleeves of a cheap suit. The formal inclusion of Scottish PF with an official parliamentary function was of obvious symbolic importance. From that point on, a steadily growing part of Civic Scotland became increasingly accustomed to meeting Pagan Federation representatives at civic events and multi-faith religious services, and also to seeing paganism included in diversity education material. To a growing number of eyes, we were starting to become normal. At the end of 2003, the SIFC mentoring group reported that we had behaved in exemplary fashion during our observership. They all felt our inclusion would enrich the Scottish Interfaith Council. They acknowledged that some member bodies might still have reservations, but pointed out that pagans had revived a religion that existed in Scotland before the advent of Christianity. Our particular interest in the environment was certainly seen as relevant today. One mentor declared that a moral obligation be placed on any who voted against us to state what their objections actually were, as this was still not clear. By the beginning of March 2004, the Scottish Pagan Federation had succeeded, with generous support from many individuals and groups across the pagan community, in raising the £2,000 or so required to commission a special analysis of the pagan responses to the 2001 national census. By the end of that month we had the figures and immediately published them. They revealed 1,930 people in Scotland identified as pagans, which was significantly lower than most contemporary estimates, but the first hard numbers ever to become available. Their significance for our interfaith campaign was obvious. Scottish pagans might be a small faith community, but we were much more numerous than both the Baha'is and the Brahma Kumaris, both of which had quite rightly been welcomed into SIFC without question. Our opponents could no longer dismiss us as a small and marginal group. After receiving this report, the SIFC executive now faced a seemingly impossible situation. Informal soundings now indicated that a narrow majority of existing member bodies of the Interfaith Council supported membership for the Scottish Pagan Federation. Against that, its two most powerful members were still threatening to leave if we were admitted. That would have all but destroyed SIFC. There was growing divergence between the views of the representatives of the two main churches within SIFC and the leaderships of their churches. Those who had actually got to know us and learned about modern paganism were increasingly sympathetic to us. However, the church hierarchy still clung to the negative stereotyping of a bygone era, and it was they who made the decisions. As early as the 26th of October 2003, the late Gordian Marshall, the Roman Catholic Church's official representative and a good man, frankly stated that the reason for his church's hostility to us was a lack of education among those who would react against paganism, an attitude he personally deplored but was powerless to change. Concerns now extended beyond SIFC itself because of the role it was intended to play as Scotland's civic, multi-faith, consultative body. On 19th August 2004, I was invited to a meeting between the Scottish Government's Equality Unit and representatives of the other non-Christian faiths, to explore possible new structures for consultation. Although no enduring new structures emerged from this, I asked for and received assurances that Scottish PF would remain within the Scottish Government's faith consultation process, even if the Scottish Interfaith Council were ultimately decided to exclude us. Soon afterwards, on 27th October 2004, and following 3 months of intensive negotiations with the Registrar General and his staff, Louise Park secured formal recognition of Scottish PF as a religious body suitable to nominate approved celebrants to conduct religious marriages under Scots law. A truly outstanding breakthrough. Legal pagan weddings had now arrived. This legal recognition was still a major topic of conversation when Scottish Interfaith Council met 4 days later to try to arrive at a decision on our membership application. But the 2 established churches remained unmoved and still declined to state what their objections to us actually were. Clearly, a decision either way would be deeply, perhaps irrevocably harmful to Scottish Interfaith Council. If PF membership could only be achieved at that point by wrecking SIFC and returning the bulk of its civic influence to the established churches, that would be an entirely counterproductive victory. In this, as in much else, we pagans must always take the long-term view. At the much-delayed meeting on 31st of October 2004, for which a vote had finally been scheduled, a compromise was put forward that was the result of very extensive consultation and negotiation by our supporters. If Scottish PF suspended its membership application for 5 years to allow further dialogue, our observer status would continue for that period, with the membership question being reopened in 2009. I am still not certain if the hierarchies of the 2 major churches fully understood the significance of this compromise at the time. They were clearly unhappy with the progress we'd already made in 2 years as observers. Obviously, we'd not be sitting on our hands with 5 more. It's possible they assumed formal membership or exclusion would be the only outcomes available. I'll never know, but their personally sympathetic but institutionally constrained representatives certainly looked happy about it. The compromise was immediately accepted, and Scottish PF continued to extend its connections and activities within Civic Scotland. Over the next few years, we certainly did not waste time, either within the interfaith process or outside it. Louise quickly built on the success of her legal pagan marriage work by throwing Scottish PF's increasing weight behind the campaign for equal marriage, in partnership with other progressive religious groups. This too would be successful in time. Fiona McAllister made progress in developing teaching materials on paganism for the religious and moral education syllabus, which were used in some Scottish schools. On Midsummer's Day 2005, at the ungodly hour of 7:27 a.m, I became the first pagan to give the Thought for the Day religious broadcast on BBC Scotland. For that, I spoke about the importance of respect for nature, respect for freedom of religion, and the importance of freedom of speech. We were now lobbying for a pagan tick box in the next 2011 census. By late 2007, we had gained the support of the General Registrar's Office for this. The pagan tick box was part of the recommended draft order that went forward for parliamentary scrutiny. I'm not going to identify the Labour MSP who blocked our pagan tick box, as it would be most unfortunate if he woke up as a frog tomorrow, but we're still just a wee bit disappointed in him. NHS Scotland's core Spiritual Care, a multi-faith resource for healthcare staff in 2007, was published, complete with its pagan section. On 23rd November 2009, Scottish PF presented its first ever public event in Scottish Interfaith Week, anchored by the wonderful harpist and storyteller Claire Hewitt. 3 days later, I and a Jewish representative were invited to offer comment from our respective faith positions on the Episcopal Bishop of Edinburgh's public lecture on pluralism. Through our continuing observer status on Scottish Interfaith Council, it was possible to secure substantial pagan input into a major new diversity education publication they produced in partnership with the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Values in Harmony, published in 2009, is a book identifying common ground between all that all the major faiths and beliefs in Scotland share, in that we all embrace various forms of the Golden Rule. Scottish PF was very happy to point out that the oldest form of the Golden Rule is found in ancient Greek pagan philosophy. Certainly a lot of progress, but we make hay while the sun shines, because the sun doesn't shine forever, particularly in Scotland. Our 5-year extended observership on SIFC was coming to an end, and this time there was no possibility of further extension. The 2 major churches remained implacably opposed to us and were exerting all the leverage they could. The vote of member bodies was held in advance of the next meeting, scheduled for 15th January 2010. As I drove down on that morning, I got a phone call telling me that SIFC had rejected our membership application, Pagan Federation involvement in SIFC was terminated, and I could not come to the meeting. I'm not a particularly sensitive man, but I got the impression they wanted me and the Scottish Pagan Federation to go away. As I mentioned earlier, the Pagan Federation does not go away, and Scottish PF is the most stubbornly persistent PF on earth. I politely thanked them for their call, explained that we would be appealing against the decision, although I knew perfectly well there was no appeals procedure, and told them I'd still be coming to the meeting. By the time I reached Glasgow, I'd learned from allies that the vote had actually been 14 votes for us, with 9 against and no abstentions. A substantial margin in our favour, but still short of the 75% support set for contested membership in the latest version of the membership criteria. And the 2 established churches still had not explained what their objections to pagans actually were. When I walked into St Mungo's, I was politely told that I could not enter the meeting, so I equally politely pulled a table up outside the door and staged a polite one-person protest for the rest of the day. This did have its funny side, as more people in the meeting supported Scottish PF than opposed us, and I had frequent visits from well-wishers expressing solidarity, while others made sure the executive understood that the decision to exclude us would not be allowed to stand. More seriously, it was becoming obvious that manoeuvring itself into a position where its membership criteria directly contradicted its stated purpose was only one of Scottish Interfaith Council's growing problems. The organisation was becoming increasingly tangled in systemic issues that seriously eroded its ability to function as intended. 3 months later, Louise and I held a further meeting with the Scottish Government Equality Unit. We told them we remained strongly supportive of SIFC, but were saddened that an organisation founded with the truly inspiring aim of working together as people of faith for a just and inclusive Scotland, an organisation that received significant public funding, should practice religious discrimination itself. They assured us that Scottish PF remained fully recognised under the Scottish Government's framework strategy in religion and belief, and that would not change. There was perhaps a hint that over time more could be done. The next 2 years were very interesting. I believed, and still believe, that in taking the actions they had to exclude the Pagan Federation, the Church of Scotland and the Scottish Roman Catholic Church had rather overreached themselves. Of course, they were much stronger and vastly more influential religious organisations than we could ever hope to be, or indeed would ever want to be. But interfaith dialogue takes place with the presumption that all the faiths are participating equally. Quite a number of member bodies had bowed before what amounted to a threat to destroy SIFC if we were allowed to join it. But I also knew some of them were not at all happy about that. Quite unintentionally, I'm sure, the main churches had put themselves in a position where it might be thought they regarded themselves as the hosts and the other Scottish religions as the guests, where interfaith was concerned. The rather surprising strategy of insisting they had strong objections to us, while failing to explain what these objections were, also worked against them over time. Strength is one thing, bullying quite another. I remained in discreet and friendly contact with a number of key individuals. Scottish Interfaith Council no longer officially included us, but a remarkable number of people in it quietly ensured that we remained almost fully involved. Most of SAFC's own activists openly ignored the Council's formal decision to reject us. Our exclusion was not only blatantly unjust, it also became increasingly silly over time. We all continued attending the same civic events, participating in the same official consultations, and generally carrying on as normal. It was obvious that things were happening beneath the surface, and we bided our time. On 3rd November 2010, the Scottish Government hosted a major civic reception in the very grand surroundings of the State Chambers of Edinburgh Castle to commemorate the 450th anniversary of the Scottish Reformation. I received an invitation, and on my way up onto the esplanade, something happened that for me has come to symbolise the amazing changes in Scottish religious culture that have happened in my lifetime, even though there's still some way to go, of course. I noticed a small demonstration just outside the security cordon. And wondering what anyone could be protesting about on this occasion, I walked over to talk to them. The demonstrators were a group of rather grim-faced, short-haired men in dark suits. In fact, they looked alarmingly like me. Perhaps hoping I might be a kindred spirit, they explained only too clearly why they were there. They were Free Presbyterians. Now, Presbyterianism is a long and honourable tradition within Protestant Christianity, one with strongly democratic, egalitarian credentials, and certainly worthy of respect. It's the tradition I myself was brought up in. But the wee Frees are so far out on the extreme intolerant edge, they are no credit to their faith or to themselves. Did I realise, they angrily asked me, that Catholics had been invited to the very civic reception I was going to? Was this not outrageous? Had the Protestant martyrs died in vain? I confess I did not express an opinion on the Protestant martyrs, merely waited till I could get a word in edgewise before saying I strongly approved of Catholics being invited, for they were part of our beautiful multi-faith Scotland and perfectly entitled to their beliefs. Then I continued peacefully towards the gates. It struck me that they could have had absolutely no idea they had been talking to a pagan. And it's probably as well that they didn't. With each generation, Scotland is leaving the hateful sectarianism that once ruled us further and further behind, and folk like that with it. Meanwhile, national level interfaith activity gradually shifted towards the Edinburgh Interfaith Association, which at this time was quite incredibly dynamic across the whole spectrum of interfaith activity, local, national and international. Aoife, of course, was a staunch supporter of pagan inclusion. Interestingly, our exclusion from Scottish Interfaith Council made no difference at all to Scottish PF's very active participation in the next major diversity guide SIFC itself was developing in partnership with the Scottish Government for NHS Education Scotland. This was a very extensive book. These are getting heavier. of multi-faith prayers, poetry and prose for use in healthcare chaplaincy. It was made available to all spiritual care teams across the country in 2011. The crucial difference between Reflections of Life and Values in Harmony and other faith guides was that both provided much more space for relative text than any multi-faith guide had had room for before. This allowed Scottish PF to present at least some pre-Christian and contemporary pagan texts on similar themes alongside one another. Values in Harmony and Reflections of Life gave us opportunity to demonstrate the strong continuity of spirit that exists between the two. In 2011, even without a tick box, the national census showed pagan numbers had increased from 1,930 to 5,194 in 10 years. Now we were in touching distance of both the Scottish Jewish and Scottish Sikh faith communities. This time, with the census analysts having much more sophisticated software than before, we did not have to pay for the data. In the summer of 2012, I received an invitation to a reception hosted by a very prominent member of the Catholic hierarchy. Although that event never took place, perhaps due to other factors affecting the Scottish Roman Catholic Church at the time, it certainly indicated which way the wind was blowing. In late 2012, I was discreetly informed that Scottish Interfaith Council was being radically restructured. But in the new arrangement, Scottish PF would certainly have membership. It could not be full voting membership because, while the major churches had learned they could not exclude us, they would accept our involvement only if it was not on fully equal terms to their own. But it would still be formal, publicly acknowledged membership of our national Scottish interfaith body for Scottish PF. This new form of associate membership will be shared with some of the other smaller faiths, the Unitarians, the Quakers and the Brahmakumaris, who were willing to become associate members themselves in order to finally bring the pagans in. I really cannot thank them enough. On 28 February 2013, the former Scottish Interfaith Council, now relaunched as Interfaith Scotland, welcomed the Pagan Federation Scotland into membership in a very friendly manner. It's hard not to like people you've spent many years arm wrestling with. Now, if any of you are still awake, that is the saga of Scottish PF's campaign for membership of Scottish Interfaith Council, recounted in slightly less diplomatic language than I could use while a serving interfaith officer. I hope it has given you some sense of just how important interfaith has been in shaping the Scottish Pagan Federation's steadily broadening and closely interlinked campaigns to advance recognition and respect for paganism alongside the other minority religions of Scotland's increasingly diverse religious culture. There is still a lot of work to be done, and Scottish PF will continue to do it. As all of you now know, our new president, Steffi von Scott, has brought the census campaign to a very successful conclusion. I hope that all of you who live here have already ticked the pagan tick box. It is because of achievements like this that Scottish PF can justly claim to be the most effective pagan organisation in Europe. Even if we're a wee bit big-headed, it's still true. I've been speaking, quite possibly in excessive detail, about a specific and significant campaign within the modern pagan revival. A revival that has been coming out of the shadows over the last few generations to become increasingly visible within the wider world. There is a place for us in the future, and we shall find our way within it. I'm also speaking as a man who spent a generation in what my heart can't help but think of as the Pagan Federation shield wall, even though my brain knows that's a somewhat inappropriate metaphor for what we actually are and do. It's important to understand that this was a campaign that was not won by ourselves alone. At root, interfaith is about education and shared human experience with other people of faith who may hold very different worldviews to our own. It is not about power. From the very beginning, a few people of other faiths supported us, and over time more joined them. We succeeded in the end by helping a sufficient number of those who were initially strongly opposed to us realise that the negative views their faiths had traditionally held about people like us were both untrue and unjust. Having reached that point, it was their own faith-based integrity and sense of justice that brought about decisive change. Scotland is a small country on the western edge of Europe. We are of little significance to any but ourselves. But I firmly believe that in the Scottish Pagan Federation's Interfaith campaign for national recognition of paganism, this wonderful flourishing graft upon ancient vital rootstock, this beloved Scotland, has served the pagan revival well. Thank you.